Hey guys, welcome to Unit 4. So make sure that you have gotten your objective and your vocabulary in your objective tracker and your warm-up as well, so we can go ahead and get started with the market revolution. So at this point, what we are looking at in American history is like the beginning of the 1800s, especially how America's economy is kind of becoming stronger and it's becoming uniquely American, where it's not really having to rely a lot on other countries. So we call this period of economic and social development, we call it the market revolution. And if you think about a market is somewhere you go, like a supermarket, or an outdoor farmer's market or something like that, where you buy and exchange goods. So the market revolution is going to be this time period in American history where we see our economy becoming really based on mass manufacturing of goods in places like factories, people buying those goods, and we call that consumption, like consumerism, and then people making money off of that through the sale of those goods. So we're going to look at the three different regions of the country, the North and the South and the West, and kind of see how all of their economies are operating and how they're all connected and allowing for America's economy, or the way America makes money, to operate. So we're actually going to start off in the South today. So in the South, there's this one really small invention. It's about the size of like a printer or something on your desk. You can see it up here. That's called the cotton gin. And it has this hand crank on it. And basically its whole job is to pull out the seeds of cotton. So if you guys have seen cotton like on like the roadside or in a field, it grows on a plant. And so it has dirt and all sorts of like debris in it. And up until the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, it would be slaves in the South who would be pulling out those seeds. And that would take hours. It was super tedious to do that. And so with the invention of the cotton gin, what would happen is you would have like dirty cotton go in on this side, and it would go through a series of brushes where you had this, hand crank right here that would literally brush the seeds out and dump them into the bottom part, and then clean, nice cotton would come out the other side. So this reduced the need for hours and hours and hours of seed pulling, as well as it allowed for a lot of cotton to be cleaned really, really easily and quickly. So what this actually leads to is the expansion of slavery. So the consequences here for the South are going to be a dependency on cotton production, which was intertwined with the practice of slavery. And as time went on and cotton moved westward, as Americans were moving westward, you can see that slavery is also going to follow. So really, the man who invented the cotton gin, his name was Eli Whitney. He didn't even own slaves. I think he was actually from the North, and he just invented this, contraption. And next thing you know, over the span of like 40, 50, 60 years, there is this huge boom in cotton slash slavery. So cotton gin directly leads to expansion of slavery. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on in the South. Let's take a look at the West. So the West would be like areas that were bought with the Louisiana Purchase, that kind of area. And a lot of that area, if you guys have been there, is known as the Great Plains. I don't have a map on here right now, but it's just kind of like the Midwest part of our country. It's pretty dry, it's pretty flat. Tornadoes are pretty common there. And you can definitely grow stuff there, like wheat grows really well, but the problem is that the soil is really hard. And so there are two inventions at this time that are really going to help with wheat production in the West, make it actually profitable and make it so people can go live there and make some money. So the first invention is called the steel plow, right here. So a plow, basically, like this part would hook up to a horse. And then there would be a farmer back here walking behind it, kind of using these handles to guide the plow. And then this is the steel plow part. It's kind of this hook that is in the ground, and it just digs really deep ruts in hard, rocky soil that you can plant seeds in. So a horse would pull this, it would create this really deep rut. Farmers would put wheat seeds in, and then that season they would have wheat. So this was invented by a guy named John Deere, who you now know for tractors, but this is going to precede tractors. This is before all that stuff was really invented. Okay, so steel plow lets you plant the seeds. So now your seeds grow, like down here, you have all this wheat, and you need to harvest it. Basically, you need to cut it down so you can sell it. And that was really tedious. And so there's an invention called the mechanical reaper, which is this whole contraption right here. So the mechanical reaper was pushed by horses, and it was a series of blades. And the blades would basically just cut down the wheat as the equipment was being pushed across the field. And then it would just lay the wheat out really nicely on the ground. This cut down manual labor a lot for those farmers, so that they didn't have to do all the work themselves or to really even, buy slaves. So, what are the consequences of these two new inventions in farm equipment? Well, it makes living in the West actually profitable. So, people want to go live there. So, you have increased westward migration, as well as, some of these areas, especially in the South, are going to try to grow cotton. Cotton doesn't grow great everywhere in the Midwest, but some people are going to want to bring slavery out there. And so, every time that you have more Americans moving out west, there's always the debate on should slavery also go out west. And we're going to look at this unit, and then obviously as we get closer to the Civil War, as all these debates start to grow, and eventually it's going to erupt in the Civil War. Okay, so we talked about the South and the West. Let's talk about the North. So the North is really focusing on the Industrial Revolution. So this is something that's happening worldwide, or I don't really want to say worldwide because it's not everywhere, but it's in Europe, and it's also happening in the Americas. And it's basically a time period where machines and factories are going to replace people making everything by hand. So, like you had this one woman making one, roll of cloth. It would take days, weeks, months, whatever to make that. We now are going to switch into a system where machines are going to do that. And we're going to have mass production, or like lots and lots and lots of rolls of cloth coming out of a factory at one time. Okay, so a few things that make the Industrial Revolution possible. One is the factory system in general, which I'm not going to define it on the slide, but it's just like the invention of factories and machines. They are going to rely not on electricity right now, but on steam engines that are powered by rivers, like the movement of the river and the water is going to help to make those steam engines possible. Okay, but you have factories and machines. Another thing that happens in the Industrial Revolution, which is really important, is interchangeable parts. So interchangeable parts were invented by Eli Whitney. It's actually the same guy who invented the cotton gin that helped the South. Interchangeable parts are something that we take for granted every day. We're just so used to them now because it's how like literally everything in a factory is made. But it's basically just like identical pieces of an item that you can take apart and reassemble really easily. Also, if a piece of that item broke, then you can just like remove that one piece and then get a new piece that works well and put it into your item. Okay, so example. Back then, guns were a really a popular thing that were made in factories, and you could use interchangeable parts for that. So like every single piece of a gun was an interchangeable part. And let's say like this piece of your gun broke right here, that's fine. Take it off, go to the factory, buy a new piece, put it on your gun. There you go. This is going to make it so that people are spending less money for goods because factories are making them so quick, and also they can replace or fix their items really easily. Like another modern day example would be cars. Like every single thing in a car is basically interchangeable part. Like you get a flat tire, cool, replace your tire. You need to replace your transmission, cool, pay a lot of money and fix your transmission. But the idea is that everything can kind of be switched out if it needs to be. And it's all put together piece by piece in a factory. Okay, I did forget one thing. This guy, Samuel Slater up here, he is actually the guy who brought the first factory plans to America. So he was from England, and he memorized how to build a factory because England didn't want other countries to get the capability of factories because then it would be competition for them. And so he actually memorized the blueprints and he took them to America, and then he built the first factory in America. Okay, so let's look at the consequences of the Industrial Revolution and interchangeable parts in factories. So, with these factories producing all these goods, we can we don't really have to rely on European goods anymore. So we're going to have American made goods. People are buying those. It's going to put money back into the factories, which is going to help strengthen the manufacturing economy in the North, as well as just like the overall American economy. When people are not making things by hand and mass manufacturing them now, prices are going to go down because there's so many goods available. Think about like supply and demand. Like if you have like a ton of something, like a lot of supply, the price goes down. A lot of the factories are focusing on textiles. Textile is a fancy way to say cloth, and a lot of that cloth is made out of southern cotton. So even though a lot of people in the North didn't like slavery, they considered it a necessary evil because they needed the cotton from the South, and slaves were the ones making the cotton. So it's going to create this relationship between the North and the South where they are dependent on each other. The North needs the cotton, and the South needs to sell the cotton. Um, these factories are also going to be built in cities, and people are moving to these cities to work in these factories. So you have the growth of these cities. I know it's kind of hard to see on the graph right here, but I mean, what you can see is a general trend, right, of these cities growing over the 17 and 1800s. Also, these people, you're going to have you're still going to have a big wealth gap, like rich are the richest and there's a lot of poor people, but there is going to be this kind of middle class that's going to rise, like people who aren't super rich but aren't super poor, that are making like an okay life and an okay salary working in factories. Okay, and then lastly, a lot of these people working in factories are women, and they're young women, like unmarried women who need to help their families make some money. And so they're moving from their houses to go live in these cities and work in these factories. And the most famous of these women were known as the Lowell Mill Girls. And here's a picture of them right here. Basically, the Lowell Mill was a textile factory in Massachusetts, and it would employ a lot of young women, and the women would go live near the factory kind of in dorms. And they would send some of their paycheck back to their family, but they also would get to keep a little bit of money for themselves. They would kind of get a taste of what it was like to live independently away from their family. But they also kind of realized eventually that they were not being paid as much as men, and their working conditions were kind of dangerous. And so these struggles that they had are going to lead women and eventually later, I mean, also men, to start to strike against some of these factory owners. And we'll talk more about strikes a little bit later on. Okay, so we talked about these three different regions of the country, right? The North, the South, and the West. And they're all doing different things for money, different like economic activities. So we need to talk about how these different regions were actually all connected um, physically. Like, how do we unite these to make a stronger America? So one way that all these regions were connected was through the telegraph. So the telegraph is this device. It's like the size of like it's really not that big. Trying to think of what it's the size of. I don't know, like a mouse to your computer or something. Basically, you put your finger on this end, and then you hit or you tap this part of the contraption, and then it causes these two little metal parts to touch, which creates an electric spark. And then the pattern in which you tap the telegraph is going to depend on what you want to say. And so people use something called Morse code, named after Samuel Morse, the guy who invented the telegraph and the code. They're going to use this code to communicate. So it's a series of dots and dashes that people can decode to send messages. And these messages would be sent over copper wires. Kind of like today, we have telephone wires. Back then, it looked really similar, just instead of cables, it was like literal copper wires that were on these telegraph lines. Okay, so that's a telegraph. that helped with communication. Next, let's look at transportation, the different ways that people kind of moved around these areas. So we have the canal. Here's a good map of the canals right here. They're mostly used in the north to connect already existing natural waterways. So things like lakes or the ocean or other rivers. These canals would be these man-made rivers or waterways that would help steamboats and stuff move around. The most famous of these canals is the Erie Canal that we will actually talk about more in 403, I believe. But it's up here in New York. Like there's Erie, so it should be somewhere around here. But it was really important. It took a long time, I mean, over 10 years or so to build. It was very, very expensive for New York, but in the end, it's going to help to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. And then eventually there's another canal that's going to connect the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River later. So you kind of have this whole like system of water transportation going on. And then the steamboats on these canals or on these rivers would move people and goods around as well. And then later on, you have the invention of railroads. And the railroads are really important because they can operate in all seasons, whereas canals can really only operate in seasons that are warm. Like you can't take a steamboat over frozen water. So railroads operate all the time, year round. And you can see here, they're all over the north and this part of the Midwest. They're also in the South, not as much, but definitely there. And then they eventually are going to move out west. And this one right here that connects basically the Mississippi River to California is called the Transcontinental Railroad. And it is going to be kind of the first like big uniting railroad between the West and the East. Okay, so what are the consequences for the connection of the regions? Well, we have instant communication that's going to help people talk between huge geographical distances for the first time. Like this is the only time in history, or the first time in history, where you see people being able to talk to each other instantly over hundreds of miles. Now we kind of take that for granted, but back then it was definitely new. So here's like a map of different telegraph lines in the United States in the 1840s. We also know that the steamboats and the canals and the railroads and stuff were all helping to move people and goods around between these regions to allow the economy to become stronger. Like you're going to have the cotton being shipped from the south to the north. You're going to have manufactured goods being shipped from the north to the south and to the west. And then you're going to have like wheat and stuff that's being shipped from the west to the north and to the south. Okay, we've made it to the end. This is a little bit of a longer notes just because we're combining two objectives. But let's look at the final consequences here. One is that the market revolution in general is going to increase something called nationalism. This is when you focus on your country's interests over the interests of your region that you live in. Another way to say this is like, it's things that unite the country. It brings the country together. So I've circled here, these are the things that bring the country together, right? Steamboats, canals, railroad, telegraph, trading between these different areas. That unites America, it helps our economy, and it physically connects the regions. At the same time that you have nationalism, you also have something called sectionalism. Sectionalism is when you prioritize your region over your country. Another way to think about this is it's anything that divides the country. It divides people apart from each other, probably causes arguments. And so what we see here is that different regions needed different things to make money. Like the South heavily relied on slavery for cotton production. The North and their factories are going to heavily rely on immigrant workers and on tariffs that make people want to buy American goods. The West is going to rely on westward expansion and people moving out west and taking advantage of the land out there. And so all these different economic needs are going to make it so that these regions, especially the North and the South, are not going to want to compromise with each other. And one of the best examples of that is the debate on slavery. And so we're going to see that eventually erupt into the Civil War later on. Okay, so based on everything you learned today, make sure that you can do your classwork and your closures so you are good to go.